gonna go ahead and get started. So I'm gonna do just a D4 for you guys tonight. If you have questions as I'm talking, feel free to interrupt me. I'm pretty laid back about that. I'm perfectly fine repeating myself or pausing my own train of thought to answer something, especially if I'm not making sense. So feel free. To start though, I'm going to do a D4. I have a little bit of a hand injury, so I'm just going to show you guys how I get the rails off. But it's something that isn't talked a whole lot about. We talk about all of our PPE and stuff when we're mixing resin, but you also want to make sure that you're wearing PPE when you're sanding. We do wet sand, so resin dust isn't a huge thing, but if you're comfortable doing it, definitely wear your respirator while you're sanding. And if you're like me and you end up sanding for like 5 hours and can't wear your respirator for that long, get yourself a really good particle mask, like a construction level one, and safety goggles, because you do not want resin splashed in your eyeballs. It's not good for you. Also wear gloves. I think that's all the PPE lecture I have. So if you give me a second, I have a really good construction particle mask that I wear when I'm sanding. So I'm gonna get that guy on really quick. And then I also just have really cheap safety goggles. So you don't need anything fancy, just to protect you from splashes. And then I'm gonna put some gloves on. All right. For the rails, I don't do a whole lot different compared to the previous polishing video that is up in the GM binder. The rails basically just take a little extra time on the starting step. So you can see on the C4 that they've got those new printed rails on there. And there's also, I don't know if I can get it in an angle where you guys can see, there's also a lot of little taller supports in the middle of the face, like the one here under this too, which is fine, not a big deal. I will say that any of the supports that are inside the faces, I find that those snag really badly. So I will go in with an X-Acto knife and just very gently pop that off of there. I'm just checking the other faces to see if there are any more. And if you have bad eyes or anything like that, you can also do it with your finger. If your glove snags on anything, it's probably also going to snag your sandpaper or your Zona paper later on. Okay, so just like the previous video, I'm just using 3M wet dry. This is the 1500. I'll also use 1000. It's whatever my hardware store has in stock between the two that day. Just happened to be 1500 last time. And then I just have, yeah, let me zoom you guys out slightly. Yeah, I just have a bowl of water over here that I literally just dunk my whole dye into. I do that for a couple of reasons. One, having to pick up a pipette in the middle of sanding just is going to make me knock stuff over because I'm klutzy. But I also do it because in between like sanding, as I'm dunking in here to get more water, it also helps wash the master off a bit, so you don't end up with too much resin dust caught in your numbers. So I'm going to start on the rail sides. These are a little taller than your face, so you have a bit of material to get off. So what I tend to do is just do about 10 circles in one direction and then 10 in the other. And that's usually enough to start getting those down. And then I'm going to rotate my die and then do another 10 in one. And then another 10 in the other. And usually between two, like doing 10 circles once, rotating the die and doing another 10 in both directions, it's usually enough to get our railings down. So you can see off of this edge, that railing's gone. We do still have a little bit on this side, which happens. It's the way that, so I'm trying to think of the best way to explain this. Basically, when these are printed, this face can sometimes catch a little extra material because this is printed toward the build plate. So all of this up here is getting dunked into your resin, and that resin's running down. And as it runs, it actually is getting cured as it goes. So you sometimes end up with a little bit of extra on some of the, like, quote unquote lower faces, which for a D4 is 3 of them. Not a big deal. I'm just going to rotate it one more time. And then since there's so little material there, I'm actually just going to do it maybe 3 or 4 times in each direction. And then check it. All right, we still have a bit. Can you guys see that? There's still a little bit of a rail there. Let me dry it off so you can see. So you see here, we still have a bit of a rail, right? We're just going to rotate. I'm going to get a little more water on it so it's still wet. There we go. All right, and that one's gone. So just rotate and do the same thing. The rails are kind of nice for a few reasons. I'm going to try to talk while counting, so I'm going to lose track, but it'll be fine. So the rails basically are taking the place of all the old supports. If you have ordered masters from Arcanicast before, you'll know that the rails are new. They allow basically these edges to stay cleaner. So if you've ordered masters before, you know that especially on the D4s, there would be like an entire line of supports here, and you would end up with like little bits of it chunked out from where the supports have been removed. The rails basically get rid of that issue. They also allow the faces themselves to be a lot cleaner in the end, like a lot crisper, because they aren't covered in supports that are then catching resin that you then have to remove. So you aren't getting as much excess material on the low faces, which is really nice. So they do require a little bit of extra work on the starting step, but it means you're not going to be making repairs as you go, which is really nice. So same thing with this one. If you notice, it's actually in the same spot. We're having trouble right here beside this one, getting that rail completely flush with the face, which is fine. It's just the product of the 3D print. So, and you'll start to notice consistencies like that as you're sanding of, oh, I have 3D6s and they all have like similar quote unquote areas that need attention. You just need a little extra love. Okay, so that one's down. We're going to do that again. I'm going to rotate it. I already know that it's still there, so I'm not even going to check it. Just rotating it, doing it again. I'm going to clean it off. We'll have another look at it. Actually looks pretty good. All right. So we do still have a tiny bit of a leftover. Again, down by the one. That's where that problem area is going to be. Just a few more circles. Oh, not quite. Just the tiniest bit still there. All right, there we go. So all those rails are down now. So we just have the face left that doesn't have any rails on it at all. You'll also notice there's no supports on this side, which almost all of your dice are going to have that. They're going to have a few faces that don't have any supports on them at all. And those faces are going to be the ones that are closest to the build plate, which also means that they're going to have the least amount of excess material on them, which means they need the least amount of sanding. So even though on the other 3 faces, I was doing about, let's say about 30 circles on each one, or sorry, no. So I was doing 10 and then 10 and then 10 and then 10. So like 50 circles on each one. On this face, I'm actually only going to do about 30. So I'm going to do 10 circles one way, 10 circles the other, and then 5 and then 5. And that's basically just enough to get our print lines down without taking off too much extra material, especially when it's not needed. All right. So as far as pressure and stuff goes, I do my best to basically hold the die as flat to the rails as possible. So these rails both went this way, right? Like off of the triangle like this. I'm not going to try to put any extra pressure to, I'm saying that the wrong way. I'm basically going to keep as steady a pressure as I can in the center of the die so that I'm not pushing the die over onto this flatter side and causing any sort of warp. I basically want to keep the pressure as centered as possible. And if I do that, the rails are going to go down first without ever hitting the other corners of the die. That's true on all of them, your D6s, your D20s. As long as you're keeping your pressure over the center and not leaning any certain direction, the rails will go down no problem at all. So other than that, after I'm done with this guy, same as my last video, I'm just going to give him a wash and use a paintbrush to get anything out of the numbers that might be in there, just to make sure I'm not contaminating any of my grits. And then I'm going to clean my work surface, change all my water out, and move on to the gray, which you guys are free to review that other video if you want to see how I get it super shiny. My hand can't take much more sanding than that right now. So I'm sorry I can't walk you guys through the entire process. But does anybody have any questions on that so far about, well, anything, not just the rails, but taking care of your master dice, how to store them, anything like that? No? How do you store them? So I have, I'm actually going to take my gloves off really quick so that I'm not touching any of my good masters with gross resiny hands. I have these foam storage boxes that I like to use. And let me just zoom out so you guys can see. I have just a foam storage box that I keep them in. I will cut sections out so that I can put my bigger masters and stuff in. The mini guys I do kind of just pile in because I almost always have to touch these up. Resin is, 3D printer resin is pretty dimensionally stable, but over time you will start to notice that things like supports pop back in. So this guy was perfectly sanded, all nice and shiny. And then he's been sitting in this box for probably about 8 months. And you can see that these supports have come back up. So I will sand him again before molding him. But that's just pretty standard. But I keep them in there to keep them scratch free. And it's kind of the same theory that you want to do with your molds. You want to always make sure that you put them away clean. And keep them in a cool, dry place. So, sorry, Kelsey, let me catch up to your question. What process do you go through creating molds with masters you've already made molds with? Like you get them, these to full polish and make molds, and then in 3 months want to use them again. How much of the process do you go through the second time? That depends on the state of the mold, or sorry, the state of the master. So with that D6, I would go from the gray zona. So I would do gray, blue, pink, and then the polishing compound. If it's only been like maybe a month or two, I usually don't need to do anything to them. At most, I'll hit them with polishing compound just to bring the shine back up to level. But yeah, it depends on what state they're put away in and how long they've been sitting there. Do you do the sanding process with all your cast dies too? Yes and no. It kind of depends on the die. So a lot of my molds are good enough that I can pull them out and just hit them with polishing compound and ink them. That's usually only for about maybe 3 pulls, and then they start to kind of need a little bit work as the mold wears. Typically speaking, I will do a blue zona and a pink zona, and then the polishing compound for anything that just has like basically the lip from the mold. Anything that has any sort of cupping on it, or has any lift, or has enough of a lip from the cap that I can like feel it with my finger, I will do gray zona, blue zona, pink, and polishing compound. I tend to sand a lot. That's just my tendency. Never use the sandpaper except for rails and supports. That's correct. Yeah. I only, if I have a really bad lifted face, I will sometimes use sandpaper. Typically speaking though, I tend to cut lifted faces off and recast them in the mold so that I no longer have that lift, because I want the corners to be true so that it rolls well. That's just my personal preference though. Cool. Thank you for asking. Not a problem at all. All right, if there are no further questions, I think I'm done. I don't think I have any other info for you guys. I appreciate you watching me sand off some pieces of plastic. What kind of plastic? You know what I mean.
All right. Heck yeah. Thank you, Heather.
Yeah, just a quick little update. Not a problem at all.
Yeah, I'm glad we did that, because then you know, at least you know, somebody will watch the class and then they get you know, a die in the mail and they go, what am I gonna do with that? So
yeah,
that's yeah, super helpful. I really appreciate you jumping back in.
Not a problem at all.
And this should be an easy one. We should have it hosted pretty soon.
Again.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all very much for sitting in.
Yeah, thanks guys. Bye.